everyone to this edition of Conversation on Change. I am so delighted that you've taken the opportunity to join us today. I am equally delighted to have my friend and colleague, Dwight Mihalec, with us today. Today's topic, why successful leaders always make time for context and accountability. Before we get started, I'll take a couple of minutes and introduce Dwight to you. Dwight Mihalec is the founder and president of Effective Managers. Effective Managers is a global consulting firm based in Canada. He has over 40 years of organizational experience and has developed extensive expertise in supporting improvement processes with large organizations. Dwight uses his experience to help CEOs and executives balance the activities that must be maintained to increase their organization's performance. He uses everyday language to present and translate complex concepts into actions that leaders can take immediately. I really like that idea, that we can take action immediately. He has an MBA from the University of Ottawa and is a certified management consultant. He also recently was elected for a 3-year term as chair of the CMC Global. Congratulations, Dwight, on your election. I'm excited for all that you're going to bring to the organization. Welcome, Dwight. Is there anything before we get started that you'd like our audience to know about you that I may not have mentioned?
You've done a wonderful job. Thank you very much, Dawn Marie. I'm just delighted to be here and looking forward to chatting with you today.
Oh, wonderful. Well, Dwight, you and I have had lots of conversations before, and I confess when I was preparing for this conversation, I was like, wow, I have a list of topics that we could have some fun with and talk about. But I decided today it might be best to explore the idea of context. You wrote a really great article back in the fall in September on why CEOs that don't create the context really fail their organization. And I can recall when I read the article that I went, yes, finally, somebody else beating that drum or presenting that option. So I thought we'd start a little bit with context and look at what that is and why it's important for leaders, and then maybe move into the real crux of where your expertise and work is in that whole area of accountability and creating accountable leaders. Does that sound like a good plan?
Sounds like a great plan.
All right.
Thanks for the compliment on that article. I enjoyed writing it. It came out of the work that I've been doing over the last few years with manager effectiveness. In my previous careers, either as a manager or head of organizations and then as a management consultant, what I was finding is that we would be spending a lot of time and effort putting in place new systems or helping to improve the organization. And yet at the end of the day, the manager, particularly middle managers, found that they weren't resourced appropriately, didn't feel that they understood what their priorities were, and just weren't able to focus in on the work that they knew was the most important. So trying to get to the bottom of that became my challenge when I semi-retired from an organization design consulting firm. We did some research with the University of Ottawa, and it always kept pointing back to accountability. So I'm glad to hear that you'd like me to come back to that, because accountability in organizations is so critically important. And starting with the head of the organization, the CEO, is absolutely important, because that's where it all starts in terms of an organization and understanding how it is that we want to do our work.
Yeah, I think that's so true. I think sometimes we forget how much impact the senior executive have on even the very frontline employees, the one that is the closest to the ground level of the organization, and how everything that they do really resonates and sends ripples through the organization, which is why that article resonated with me, because I work a lot with organizations that are dealing with change and trying to implement change, and I find that sense of context and for me that's all about, why are we doing this? Where does it sit in our priorities? Why now? Why this solution, not that solution? All of that seems to get overlooked or missed. I hear leaders go, well, everybody knows, or we don't have time for all of this. We just got to get things done. So I'm curious as to, in your work and the impetus for this article, what you found was why there's such a hesitation to provide context.
Yeah. CEOs are in a really tough situation because they're between the organization as a whole and the environment, where they're dealing with outside investors perhaps, or owners, or a board, with client organizations and so on. So they're externally focused to a large degree, but at the same time they're in charge of the entire organization because they have a strategy that they're trying to implement, which is based on a business model that they care passionately about. So the challenge that they have is to divide themselves and find that balance between how do I move this organization forward over the coming years, but how do I ensure that this black box of an organization is doing the things that it needs to do in the most efficient way. And part of that balancing act is that we don't want to have situations in organizations where everyone is in lockstep with the CEO. So the CEO doesn't have the time, nor should they be saying, do this today, do this tomorrow. They need to be helping their team understand what needs to happen from each of them, so that they, working collaboratively, are helping the CEO to ensure that that strategy is being implemented. So that means, how do we set context to help people understand what their role is vis-a-vis what we need to do for the overall strategy of the organization, so that people can make decisions and can take initiatives independently, but know that it's within the context of where we need to do our work in the coming days, weeks, months, depending what level of the organization you're in.
Yeah, so context is not just about the context of a particular situation. What I hear and what you just said, it's also about setting priorities and being really clear on priorities for the organization and how the pieces fit together. Yeah, and one of the things you talked about was the idea that, you know, the CEO has this unique position. And you're right. I mean, the last thing we want, especially in a large organization, well, even in a small organization, is the CEO micromanaging everybody and telling everybody how to do their job in addition to what needs to be done. That doesn't bode well for any organization. So the CEO, and when I say CEO, I almost think also senior executive as a whole, right? It's not just.
I agree.
Yeah, you think the same thing. They're in this unique position, but part of it also is, and again, I'll come at it a little bit from my perspective, working with organizations trying to move change through the organization, that many of the organizations that I see are in this rapid movement of change. They've got multiple change initiatives on the go, and that can create some blind spots for the CEO, because what I have found is that they will lose sight of some of those change initiatives, the changes that they're trying to make. They're down into the organization, further and further away, which then creates a blind spot at the top in terms of setting priorities and context. And I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's an absolutely great question. If we think about CEOs, you make the point that re-emphasize the point I made, that you don't want the CEO or the head of the organization micromanaging. Unfortunately, often I find that the opposite happens. So they say, we've hired senior people, we have our strategy in place, the board approved it, so go ahead and implement. So that's almost an abdication of the role of helping subordinates understand what in fact are those priorities. So it's part of the idea of setting context is to work with each one of your team members individually, and then the team as a whole, to really set these priorities in terms of what has to happen in finance, in operations, in sales, in all of the different department areas, so that all of us collaborating together can do what is necessary. Because if you abdicate, to use my word, and let everybody get on with it, they by their very nature have a built-in filter in terms of their department. If I'm the head of finance, then in order to achieve the strategy, I want my finance department to be the best finance department there is, so we should have these financial management systems in place. If I'm in production, I need this new equipment so we can produce more, better, faster to meet the strategy plans. And in spite of best efforts, if there's not that manager overseeing how we collaborate, those filters will apply, and then before you know it, each of us are pulling the organization in a slightly different way. We're not collaborating, we're not speaking well enough, and when it comes time to support each other, we're so busy focused in on that which we feel is the most important, we don't have the resources to support on the other side. So this balancing act, this is I purposefully picked that as part of the title of my book, The CEO, The Balancing Act, The Effective CEO, is that they have to find the balancing act between people focusing in on their functional areas, which is in fact their most important work, but also supporting each other in terms of how do we collaborate to jointly help the CEO or the general manager achieve what we need to achieve.
So part of what I think I'm hearing in that, and I certainly advocate for that, and it's funny because I will often say that senior leaders abdicate their responsibility when it comes to change. You know, at some level, I'm really delighted to see organizations put change management teams in place, and some of them have created change management offices. But unfortunately, the downside of that has often been that then senior leaders, and not necessarily just senior leaders, but leaders in general go, well, change management will look after that. Well, that's the job of the change management office. And it's more of an abdication than a delegation or a collaboration. And I see it more as a collaboration, using that expertise within the organization to help leaders advance their change a little bit more.
Exactly. That brings us to accountability. Lovely segue.
Right.
And there's two parts to that, because one part is the accountability of what I call the effective point of accountability. So that managerial role, which is accountable for implementing something. So change can be relatively simple. If I'm the manager of a team and I'm putting a new process in place for my team, I'm accountable for doing that. I can work with my team members and we can implement fairly easily. If I'm the CEO or an owner of an organization, it's more complex because I'm managing change across teams of teams and across the various teams and trying to figure out how it is that we implement this. So the first part of this is I have to realize my accountability for setting context and being very clear about expectations for outcomes and staying with that change process through to the end and watching it as it's implemented to make sure that we are in fact devoting the resources to this change that are necessary. So if you take your eye off the ball too soon, what happens is it's kind of implemented at the top level of the organization, but then the next levels kind of lose interest because it's not the CEO's change project of the day anymore. The second part of it is how do you delegate accountability for the actual implementation of the change? And what triggered that for me, Dawn Marie, is your comment that too often it's the change management team or the head of HR or the head of IT is going to implement this change. In fact, if it's a change that's necessary for how we work differently, it's those executives or managers who are accountable for work in their units that are accountable for the aspects of the change that apply to them. So the CEO is accountable, in fact, for the overall change. IT would be accountable for implementing it in IT, the CFO within finance, and so on. And certainly on the side, you might have a head of HR or an organization change specialist supporting and assisting in this change. You might have external consultants also helping, but you can't lose sight of the fact that it's the operational people, the people that are in charge of their teams, that have to be held accountable for implementing the change. Otherwise, it won't happen because the person who's been delegated the accountability doesn't have the authority to make the changes that are necessary.
Oh, I totally agree with that. You know, one of the big things that I talk about in terms of change is that whole idea of active involvement, right? And that this idea that you can bring in an external change team, or you can have some external people that not only are they not accountable, but they don't have any vested interest in it. At the end of the day, I'm going to go home. I'm going to go back to my organization, whatever. And so to be able to create that capacity and get those organizational leaders to see themselves as you are the change leaders in your organization. It cannot happen unless you are in there doing that, that accountability.
Yeah, each manager in the organization, and by manager I mean anyone that's accountable for a team. So the CEO is a manager in that sense as well, probably the most important manager in the organization. So that managerial work becomes really, really important, both for doing our value-added work, but also for the whatever change process or continuous improvement is necessary for doing it better and for achieving the overall strategy of the organization in due course.
So what do you say in your work when you're working with leaders and maybe you don't get it, or, oh, well, that's fine, but we don't have time for all of that. I mean, time is the big barrier that gets to me. We know, Damarie, that's nice to do, but we don't have time for all that. What do you get and what do you do with your leaders when they go, well, that's really great, but look, I've got an operation to run. I don't have time to run the change as well. I'm curious about your response to that.
Yeah. The immediate response, of course, is you don't have time not to do it, but that seldom gets a very good reaction. So it's so true, and so often those heads of department, and it's become so obvious, the ones that need the change the most are the ones that can never find the time to make the change, when in fact what we're trying to do is make their lives easier. But this does circle right back to the role of the head of the organization, because the CEO needs to understand and model the importance of this change. And when we work with clients, we work in a cascading implementation. So always information is gathered from the bottom up, because we need to know what's happening on the front line to understand how to implement the change. But when it comes time to implement, the CEO needs to have really strong one-on-one conversations with each individual in terms of what does this mean differently in terms of how you will work differently tomorrow, and how I will work differently tomorrow, and how our interchanges will change in order to be able to implement this change. So you have that session, everyone agrees to how they're going to be working differently, and then the accountability is very clearly laid out at the end of that conversation, that each one of the subordinate executives now must have exactly that same meeting with their team members, so that you have a cascading implementation of the new way of working. So it's not so much then a change manager waving the flag saying do things differently, it's people starting to work differently from the top and modeling that working differently and feeling accountable to make sure that their teams work differently as well.
Oh, I totally agree. Yeah, I think we underestimate the power, and I said this, that the CEOs and these senior executives have. One of the key questions I always ask leaders when I go in is, what do you need to do differently in order to affect the outcome that you want? And I always know an organization is in trouble when the leader says, well, I don't have to do anything differently. This is all about them. Right. It's my employees that need to do things differently. I know that the likelihood of success is low at that point, right?
You're exactly right.
I'm curious then, because there's this cascading, and the other thing that I heard in this that's really is a bit about both accountability and context. And again, my area of focus is primarily on that organizational change and change leadership, not as much on the change management. Those are tools and techniques, and they're important. It's all about leading change, right? And one of the things that I heard in terms of those conversations and those cascading conversations is that in identifying the priorities and what you need to do different, and it seems to me that one of the other things that might be missing, and maybe you do it in your work, but I certainly see some of it missing in the leaders that I work with, is then the idea, because there are often multiple changes, on a holistic view. So we can say, well, what do I need to do differently? But if we don't have a sense of how the changes and the operations are interconnected, then we can also see conflict within the individual leaders. And you kind of address that in that context article where the leader goes, well, I got to the 39th floor. Do I go down a floor? Do I go over? Like, so how do we address that, both through accountability and through some of the work that you're doing?
I do see that as a major issue in organizations. And one of the fundamental issues in organizations is that in terms of managerial leadership, we don't have a language that's consistently used. So very often in meetings, you will hear a CEO say something like, the CFO is in charge of the budget process. So on the face of it, that kind of makes sense. But when you start to implement that, what does that mean in terms of what the authority is that individual has then for the budget process? Can they tell all of their peers what to do? Can they direct them to take part in a process at a certain time frame? If there's a disagreement, how do they resolve that disagreement, and so on? So some of the early work we did with effective managers was create the effective point of accountability, which is language that can be used in the organization in a consistent way in terms of how do we work together in the organization, how do we collaborate in the organization, but also how do we delegate work down the organization. So it creates this what I call the rules of the road for organizations, because it helps us understand how it is that we collaborate together, what accountability really is in terms of the different things that we have to do, but also what that means for our peers in terms of authority across the organization. So once you have that kind of a language in place and people start using words in the same way, it makes it so much easier for people to understand what their relationships are and how they have to collaborate with each other.
I really like the idea of language. Same thing. I talk a lot about the use of language in terms of organizational change. Can you maybe, I like the idea, and I can see the finance is a really good example where, the finance has been given the priority to cut costs and be efficient. And I'm thinking of the IT director that's been told to be innovative and cutting edge and use the best technology. And I can see where those two priorities are consistent with strategy, but inconsistent in execution. So can you give an example of how you would use your language of accountability to try and resolve, say, a conflict like that?
Yeah. So the example you gave is a great one. So if the head of finance feels that in terms of the overall budget and it's a tough year, they have authority over spending, and the head of IT feels that this IT project is really important for the strategy and they need some to spend their 100% of their budget in order to be able to put this new program in place, the conflict, you can see where the conflict comes up easily, because they request the purchase order for this new supplier to help them develop the software, and the CFO says, no, sorry, we don't have the budget this year. So the conflict immediately says, what do you mean? It's in my budget. And the CFO says, no, I'm sorry, I don't think you should be spending it. So there's the conflict at the peer level. If the CFO were able to make it more clear using language in terms of the CFO having accountability for monitoring, is one of the words that we use, the budget, this then gives them the authority to monitor spending in all the other departments. To have access to that individual if they feel someone is about to go outside of the bounds of what the policies might be, and to try to convince them to change. So it's one of the persuading accountabilities and authorities that we have. And if they can't agree, it requires the person who is the monitor to escalate that to the next level so the three of them can have a discussion. Because in that situation, only the CEO actually has the authority and the context from their perspective about which is better for the organization. Perhaps that the IT project is so fundamental to the strategy that he or she would agree, yes, we need to spend that extra money, even though we'll go over budget in that area, but it's really important to us. Or might agree, yes, the CFO has a really good point. We don't have the money for that, and it's not a strategic priority right now. But in the doing of that, then you've reset the context so that the two of them know how to inter-react on these matters going forward, so you don't have to escalate again. It all comes down to having a clear understanding of what that languages. Monitoring then, instead of in charge of, has very specific meaning.
I like that idea of monitoring, and I guess at the outset, you, as part of that monitoring language, I would know if I was the IT director or HR or whoever, what your authority is. Like you have the authority to monitor, so I can see where it would also reduce the level of conflict when in that monitoring role, you're asking for information that I might feel like, hey, it's my budget, I get to do what I want. You're kind of, as I heard one leader say, you're driving in my lane. But if you've got that language, and I know that your role is to monitor, then all of those questions become not a defensiveness, don't raise that defensive response to me. They then say, I see that. Okay, Dwight, let's have a conversation. Let me explain this to you. It might not even ever have to escalate to the CEO.
Exactly. And in most situations it doesn't, because of the requirement to escalate if you can't reach agreement. So managers will try to reach that agreement in terms of what would the CEO say if we were to sit down in front of him or her and have that discussion. And by working it through in that context, knowing what monitoring means, it becomes a lot easier to come to that agreement than otherwise.
And I suppose then there's also the kind of the area where I'm the decision maker, and so I get to decide whether you get to spend that money or not, or that kind of thing. And that's all kind of upfront and known when you create your accountability structure.
Yes, exactly. And we pick on finance a lot because it usually is in trouble because it's so easy to measure the dollars and the cents. But it happens in other areas. Sales and production is another area. Sales is always trying to sell the best features in the shortest time frame, and production is trying to get the highest quality at the lowest cost. And those things are often working against each other. So again, you need to have the context about how it is that we collaborate together for the best thing that's for the company overall. So what is the strategic positioning of our company, and how do we make these decisions? And only the higher level manager can set the context in terms of how we make those trade-offs.
I really like the idea of creating these really accountable organizations. I get a sense though they're not a lot of organizations that really, that is kind of the highest level, what you're describing, because that would be cascaded right down to a frontline supervisor. Almost at an employee level, I'd be very accountable. If I'm feeling accountable, I know what my decisions are, and when somebody's asking me questions, I know whether their role is as a decision maker or monitor, So I guess the first thing is it really that ideal situation? And what do you see in terms of the percentage? Let's start with that. Let's start with something quantitative. What do you see in terms of the percentage of organizations that actually live this kind of accountability? Any ideas?
I wish I knew. If I was a betting person, I would say it's 20% or less.
Yeah.
And they were some of the most successful organizations. So it's not well done. On the other hand, if you look at the research that we've done and look at manager effectiveness, we find that managers report that they're only spending just over half of their time on value-added work. So there's a huge amount of churn in organization that is wasted because people are very busy. I'm not saying managers aren't busy. They work like the dickens, but they're not able to focus in on the work that they know is important because so much is getting in the way of them being able to do that. So even successful organizations that aren't using an approach like this have huge areas for improvement to be able to be even more successful. So I'm amazed at how successful organizations can be when there's so much internal waste in terms of people being able to focus in on the most important work. So yes, it's not as well used as I think it could and should be, and the human potential for doing better and for helping organizations be even more successful is huge as a result.
Yeah, I can see that. I can see even the potential for conflict reduction, right? So much of the conflict that we see, and also from an organizational change perspective, so much of the conflict that is there comes from a misunderstanding of what your role is versus my role is, and what's accountable for it. So I can certainly see the value of this. If for an organization, I guess the other thing that comes to mind, and maybe this is a bit of my experience coming out, but I can see organizations that aren't accountable now and don't practice this in any sort of way at all, unfortunately. And I can see the possibility for them to move to this. But I can also understand the human response to this kind of setup. And I can imagine that when you first start and an organization first starts to do this, it can create a lot of anxiety and apprehension. People often fear the word accountability. I'm going to hold you accountable and what that means. Can you talk a little bit about if that's something that you experience, and maybe a little bit about how you address it?
Yeah, it's it is an unfortunate reality that you've just described, and unfortunately, in most organizations, you only hear the word accountable when something goes wrong. And you usually hear it when someone is yelling at a board table saying, "Who's accountable for that? And how are you going to get it fixed?" So the trick in organizations is not to misuse language in that way. What we're really talking about is how do we create a system where we all understand how we work together in this organization. So it comes back to this rules of the road that we talked about. If we didn't have rules of the road for driving in cities, it would be gridlock, because we wouldn't know which side of the road to drive on, what a traffic light meant, what a signal light was, or whatever. So we've developed these protocols around how we manage, even heavy traffic in a way that makes sense. So in organizations, also very, very complex entities, we also need these quotation marks rules of the road for how we collaborate and how we help each other. So it doesn't have to be the big heavy "you are accountable." It's what is the language that we use for how we relate to each other. So how do we manage here, and how do we collaborate here?
And how do we ease organizations? I think part of the conversation needs to be, how do we ease organizations? Because accountability to me seems also like one of those words like empowerment, right? It's like, oh, well, we're going to make our employees accountable. No, run in fear. Or we're going to empower our employees. Why didn't they make that decision? They're empowered to make that decision, And I think back in the 90s, when that, empowerment takes more than a minute kind of thing, and accountability I see very similar, came out. It's like yesterday you couldn't make $1 million decision. Suddenly today you're given the power to do so, but mentally, psychologically, emotionally, you're no more prepared to make that decision today than you were yesterday. Is accountability similar?
It is actually. Empowerment became a synonym for abdication, actually. So I'm going to empower my employees so I don't have to manage anymore. Yay! My life got easier, when in fact it makes things worse. So in accountability, my recommendation to organizations is to talk to managers, to get feedback from managers. So we have an assessment process to enable that, but there are many different ways to do that, where you can find out from managers what their life is like and how they're feeling in terms of being able to focus in on their most important work. Because in my experience with managers, and every time we've done the assessment in organizations, they've appreciated this opportunity to tell their story about why they can't do what they feel they need to get done. And then when it comes time to implementation and to make the change, the CEO and the senior executive are responding to that and can take that into account. It's very real. It's not a trick. It's very real feedback that can be used for a basis of a change program, and to bring in a language that's consistent in the organization. There are lots of different models out there. I have one, but my big advice to my clients is pick terms that are consistently used and use them consistently, and you'll be much better off, because then people will understand how to collaborate together.
I think that's really valuable and important advice. Is so much of it depends on our language, right? And I see the same thing with organizational change. I talk about adopting a language of readiness versus a language based grounded in resistance, because when you use a language grounded in resistance, you are resistant to change. We end up labeling and behaviors that are perfectly normal behaviors and isolating people that could be real allies and are actually quite committed to making change happen in the organization. I see similar here with accountability.
I agree completely.
Yeah. Because one of the things that you couple, and I really like the way you do that. I'm looking at your sheet on managerial accountability, and you couple accountability with authority, and they go hand in hand. Can you talk a little bit about how they're interrelated?
They do go hand in hand, absolutely. In terms of work as a manager, my personal output, if I'm delegated an accountability for doing something, and a change manager or a project coordinator is a perfect example of that. You're accountable for implementing this change, but if I don't have the authority over those with whom we're going to be implementing the change, then I can very quickly run into a dead end. So I end up killing myself trying to negotiate my way through a very major change program in an organization. So the accountability and authority need to be linked exactly. When it comes to cross-functional work, that becomes even more important, because there are so many different variables in terms of how we will work together and when we will work together, that again, having the specific language as we talked about it, but each type of accountability, my monitoring example that I gave to you came with the 3 specific authorities that were bundled with it. And if you don't have the authorities that go along with it, then the word monitoring in and of itself doesn't mean much, because I say to you, the IT manager, I'm going to monitor you on this, and say, okay, that's fine, but I don't have time to talk to you today, or I'm not willing to be persuaded, just go away and leave me alone because this is important work, or whatever it might be in polite terms, but you're just not able to get the traction you need because the organization hasn't set the context, again, for the CEO, the context in terms of how we will collaborate in these different types of scenarios.
Right. And I can see that while it may change over time, like if we go back to, we're picking on the finance and the IT departments today, so we'll continue to do that. But I can see then where it could also reverse at some point, where now the IT department has the monitoring role for the finance department. So these aren't static, they're more like dynamic. Yeah, it's more dynamic in an organization. So do you find that organizations that are new to this kind of structure and new to the idea of building this kind of accountability get stuck in, well, wait a minute, I'm supposed to have, and so I always have this monitoring role, versus seeing it as a more fluid way of operating versus this is my job that,
Exactly. And in the same way that the CFO is monitoring finances across the organization, the head of IT would be monitoring IT applications across the organization, and there would be specific things that they would monitor against. We have other categories that are less onerous, like advising, and we have other types of areas where one can actually instruct someone under very specific circumstances. So finding that balance is correct. So as we do this, and implement it in organizations, again, it starts with the conversation. So it's the CEO and each of the subordinates sitting down and saying, now what do you need from each other in order to be able to do your work? And then what do we need in terms of monitoring each other's policies, because it should be policy based or process based in some way. It's not monitoring nothing, it's monitoring against something. And once you have that in place, then you can start to have the discussions about what does this actually mean. And over time, it may change. That decision that the CEO made about CFO and IT might be different 2 years from now if the finances have lightened up. So it's very fluid in all directions, because organizations are changing and the dynamics within organizations are changing and the environment is changing. So again comes down to that balancing act of the CEO.
Well, and I would see that that balancing act starts transitioning. It starts at the CEO, but it starts each level of that leadership balances that aspect of accountability and authority, ensuring that people who are being held accountable have the right authority, ensuring that that language is there. I can also see where language, and maybe I've got it wrong, but you can let me know. I can also see where language can help to build a sense of trust that might not be there overall, because I can envision a situation where, you know, you and I are having what seems like it's a bit of a conflict on direction, and I can quickly, because we've got that language, say, you know what, I'm going to put on my planner hat right now, and if that's okay, you know, talk a little bit about that, or I'm going to put on my monitoring hat or something like that. Do you find that in the organizations?
That's absolutely correct. It does make a big difference. And if you think about the opposite scenario, I'm in production in some regional area, and I applied for a staff person that I know, I've got the vacancy, and HR says, no, sorry, I'm not going to do it now. We don't have the money for it. And here I am left abandoned. That's not very trust building in terms of I need this person to be able to run my organization, as opposed to having the language that there is that they are a monitor and they're monitoring against a policy which has a hiring freeze for some reason, for example. So the kind of the logic and the understanding and the thinking about what are our accountability and authority relationships, if it's not there, it's kind of made up as it goes along, and individuals tend not to agree with that. So that is absolutely not trust inducing, as you say.
Right. Well, also I can see where it builds some empathy as well, right? Because now, again, we have this language, we have a willingness to have a conversation. I can see, using the HR example, you've denied my request. Rather than getting angry, I'm going to come and have a conversation with you, because we've set up that as the go-to place, and we're going to see if we can work it out from that perspective. Yeah.
And even more so, we know that the policy in this organization is that if you and I can't agree, then we will go to our respective managers and see if we can work it out. So it's not left abandoned. There's a process in place for coming to a resolution that, if not mutually agreed, at least is mutually understood.
The other thing that I hear in all of this, and I'm a big proponent of it, for organizational change, is that you don't create accountable organizations that trust each other through email. It really is about having the conversations. It's about connecting with the person, listening to not what you think they're saying, but really paying attention to hear them and having that conversation. And it's a big area for me in terms of organizational change, and trying to get leaders off the keyboard to have those conversations.
I agree. And, you know, to me, there's no such thing as an accountable organization. It's a nice buzzword now, and people are after accountable organizations. It's organizations full of accountable people. And that only happens through the kinds of conversations that you're talking about. I agree with you. And a language that's commonly understood. Otherwise, you can have the conversation and you each come away with a different thought about what that means.
Yeah, and that's the risk of email, right? Everybody thinks they've communicated really well with email. I've spent hours composing this email, and you've had the worst morning. You get my email that I think you're going to be really excited about, and it makes you incredibly angry and frustrated, and I never hear from you. And then suddenly I do end up having to engage with you, and I get this huge backlash from an email maybe I sent a week ago that I'd forgotten all about, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, this has been really fascinating for me, where I'm asking all of the participants in the conversation the same question at the end. And that is, if a leader could only do one thing to help his organization move from wherever they are now on that accountability scale to a higher level of accountability, what what would you recommend? What would be one action that they could apply immediately following this conversation that would move their needle a little bit closer to that ideal situation?
From the menu, it's about that. I think it's about that conversation with their team. So it's to come to some common realization at the team level about how accountable are we and how well do we understand our relationships with each other in terms of cross-functional work. So if there's any area in organization that is endemic, it's silos. Because of people's interest in their functional areas. So starting the conversation is the number one step.
All right. I think that's a great place to start. And then creating, even they can use your language. And of course, engaging with you and getting an assessment done is probably a good thing to do. But starting with the conversation, creating a language for themselves. When I say monitoring, this is what it means. When I say decision maker, the things I make decisions on, and I have veto power in these areas, and I have collaboration and consultation powers in these areas.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think really powerful. Well, before we wind up, Dwight, is there anything else that you think our listeners would, that you really want them to know when they think about context and accountability and really making time for these things as leaders in their organization?
It does come down to pay the piper now or pay the piper later. So to the extent that managers make time to do their managerial leadership work, their teams will be more effective. Each of the individuals on the team will be more effective, and as a result, the organization as a whole is going to be more successful. So it's so easy every day to say, I know somebody needs a coaching session, but I don't have time today, or we're going to postpone our manager meeting because this other priority came up, or the performance management meeting is going to be delayed until next month because we have the press of all these urgent matters. And yet it's those things that are so critically important to get rid of the churn in the organization so you do have time for them. So do the managerial leadership work. It's really, really important.
I think that's a great place to end our session on. Actually, to be a manager, you have to do the managerial work, and manager and leader are two sides of the same coin for me. So to be a leader and to be a manager, you have to put the managerial and leadership work first.
Exactly. You really do.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Dwight. It's been a pleasure to have this conversation with you, and I'll look forward to having another one soon.
Thanks for the invitation, Dawn Marie. I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks a lot.